geopolitics again, my third in a series about China. Again, taken off a conversation that we were having with friends, and the general narrative that comes out is, we've got to admire China for what it's done, or not China, what CCP has done, all these glittering skyscrapers in Shanghai, Beijing, the highways, now the new high-speed HSN railways, and of the triangular railways, etc., etc. The question becomes, will it be used? The information that we have is that 70% of the HSNs are running into loss because the capacity utilization is less than 30%. Half the buildings in most of these new towns are lying empty. Now the question becomes, so here's the saying then that comes in. All folks that glitters, how many times have we heard that? All that glitters is not gold. So that's what it is, folks. That's what China, right? And especially when you try and compare it to the United States, the people say, hey, but even in the US, look at it, they built all the road network after Second World War by Teddy Roosevelt is what started the economic miracle of the United States. They figure that this new high-speed network of rails is what's going to deliver the same. But there's a big difference between the two. The big difference is that the United States was at the bottom of its economic cycle, right? And it went up after that. What's happening with China is it's at the plateau. It's trying to rev itself up at this plateau, and it's exhausted itself as far as I can see, right? Why is it exhausted itself is because firstly its basic narrative about driving its economy through exports is going to falter. It's not in the last few months because all of a sudden you've seen deficits both in countries like India, Europe and the United States, trade deficits balance with China go up. But that's a temporary blip. That was to be expected because almost every other country was suffering during their lockdowns, and China came out much faster. That was to be expected. But going into the long run, 4 to 5 years from now, that is going to be as I reported yesterday, a report from a history professor out of Harvard, that has now reached its sell-by date for China. It's got to be domestic demand. And the question is, domestic demand is also got a problem because, you have a situation, I'm going to read this out now, and you'll find that extremely interesting. You find that it's not that easy to suddenly switch from external demand to internal demand. It's not going to work that way because now the millennials are involved across the world who suddenly don't feel the need to own a house. Right? And then, and especially in China, you have another problem. The rural people find it's impossible for the rural people to migrate to the urban areas because the government doesn't allow it. Right? And you got to hear this, right? And you know that China is up against a war, right? Is that Chinese millennials are chilling and Beijing isn't happy about it. He says 5 years ago, Lu Huazong discovered that he enjoyed doing nothing. He quit his job as a factory worker in China, biked 2,092 kilometers from Sichuan province to Tibet, and decided he could get by on odd jobs and $60 a month from his savings. He called his new lifestyle lying flat. I have been chilling. Lu 31 wrote in a blog post in April describing his way of life. A generation ago, the route to success in China was to work hard, get married and have kids. The country's authoritarianism was seen as a fair trade-off as millions were lifted out of poverty. But with people working longer hours and housing prices rising faster than incomes, many youngsters fear they will be the first generation not to do better than their parents. They are now defying the country's long-held prosperity narrative by refusing to participate in it. Lu's blog was removed by censors who saw it as a front to Beijing's economic ambition. And this is the war. And then you have these actions that also are acting as a war. China suspends Didi app downloads over personal data violation because apparently Didi didn't give this data to the CCP, right? Then you have, this is interesting, that India has to walk up. Shikha Agarwal, cast in China's image, Beijing uses party-to-party diplomacy to craft narratives, including on COVID. And this is where you suddenly find Sitaram Yechuri coming out and praising the only guy who came out and wished China on this anniversary, right? On CCP's anniversary. A prominent strategy employed by CCP to advance its role in global politics is party-to-party diplomacy, through which the CCP manufactures consent for Beijing-led narratives, geostrategic constructs, and China's global ambitions among political elites and parties in other countries. The party organ dedicated to this enterprise is the IDCPC. She says, interestingly, the BRI segment of CPC's COVID-19 strategy was accorded special emphasis in the case of Nepal and Sri Lanka. The IDCPC established joint consultation mechanism on the BRI between the CPC and major political parties from the two nations. The IDCPC represents a crucial component of the strategic and institutional paraphernalia employed by the CCP to belie all predictions to its impending doom and continue with its relentless march to cast international politics in its own image. The other dangerous one is what Vijay Gokhale writes, party's magic weapon. He says it's called the United Front Work Department, UFWD, is barely understood and thus underestimated. What he says is, beyond general effort to foster a benign and positive image in international public opinion through feel-good stories, the UFWD is bent on creating a common cultural narrative in Eurasia. The BRI and its ideological twin, the Community of Shared Future for Mankind, are more than just foreign policy doctrine. Okay? The salience of other civilizations in this context, a key CPC goal is to build influence at the ideational level through Buddhism as a cultural resource in order to create a common cultural narrative in Eurasia, and this is where Nepal comes into play, and this is why the five-finger policy comes into play. He says on the UFW influence operations in Southeast Asia shows how China quotes senior members of the Buddhist clergy to foster a collective cultural connect, and how efforts are underway to include Buddhism in the BRI in order to potentially create a conduit to influence political decision making. And here India has to be careful and now has to throw a spanner in China's works, right, by taking control of Buddhism. The observation is equally relevant for India, which has a significant Buddhist population in states bordering China, as well as for three neighboring countries, Myanmar, Bhutan and Nepal, which are either Buddhists or have a historical and cultural connect with Buddhism. Such efforts are all the more sinister when the CPC claims to be staunchly atheist and forbids its own members from practicing religion. This is the important part, folks. And remember, Mao is back in play. Hence, Five Fingers is back in play. Hence, Arunachal and Ladakh is back in play. And the other thing back in play is hydrology. He says CCP centenary and Mao's hydro legacy. He says, however, on the abundant water resources in Tibet, Mao authorized redistribution, observing the South Tibet has a lot of water, the North little. If possible, it is okay to lend a little water. Later in his points, swimming, translated, Mao poured out his desire to build dams on Yangtze, which he loved to swim in, writing, walls of stone will stand upstream. From Mao to Xi Jinping, China continues to maintain status quo on its upstream activities. In increasingly state-directed development, water will remain remain an independent, controllable, and reliable catalyst for China. That means downstream countries, including India, have a lot to be concerned about. I am more concerned, folks, because Mao is back in play, which means 1962, 1959 redux teach India a lesson. Now, what does Pallavi Iyer says? Coercion and co-option, twin secrets to CCP's longevity. What is clear is that the predicted collapse of the CCP by Western commentators is unlikely to happen in a hurry. Nonetheless, under Xi, the party does face some serious challenges. How will Beijing cope with the US as an open adversary rather than the trade and investment partner it has been so far? This is a critical answer. The answer, while critical, is unclear. What is clear is that CCP will need to do a balancing act that could prove tough for acrobats even as skilled as the Chinese folks. As the winds are now, headwinds are being faced by China. And the interesting thing to note what I read in the Times of London. So basically what's happening is they're trying to rewrite history to drive and reshape the world order, which not very many people are going to like. And also things like upsetting other countries. So Australia now blames China for fixing the UN against that edict that they made about the reef, right? And while all that glitters is not good, but there are certain things you can learn from China, as seen by C. Raja Mohan. What he says is, India's persistent romantic internationalism and constructing a common front with China has now taken a big beating. At the same time, CCP might be the best guide for Delhi on finding the right balance between international and nationalism. For any nation, large or small, internationalism can't be an end in itself. It is a critical instrument in strengthening national unity, security, prosperity. There's much that India can learn from China on building flexible global coalitions, adapting quickly to changing internal needs and external circumstances, and devising slogans to suit policy rather than let policy become a prisoner of slogans. And like I said, Here's one interesting, Wall Street's new love affair with China, and this is where Didi probably came into play. China hit Didi, crashed it 5% in the Nasdaq, and guess the guys who suffered? The Wall Street guys who have a love affair with them. But now, as Pranab Dhal Samta writes, Act 3, Section 2, re-enter India. He says India needs to play itself back into lead position in the China game. He said the working dictum of the past 3 decades that differences on the LOAC will not impact progress in the rest of the relationship has been set aside. A year on, the Chinese threat is now a full-blown global phenomenon. Many countries have either shed or are in the process of shedding their strategic ambivalence towards China. The US is perhaps the most significant of them all. Beijing's hope that Joe Biden will roll back Donald Trump's China policies and explore a new deal have not quite worked out. If anything, Biden has not just carried forward unfinished business, but has also sought to align other democracies to the US position. He says, by all accounts, there was a clear meeting of minds between the US, Canada, Australia, Britain, France and Japan. The 2 countries that still seem to maintain a degree of ambivalence are Germany and Italy, possibly due to the increased economic dependence. But the gap between the EU and China has begun to grow. It has. Indo-Pacific is a theater where the tectonic plates of Chinese authoritarianism clash with world democracy. China is indulging in economic coercion with other countries by weaponizing trade and investment. This is what the United States is saying. China has taken advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic to aggressively pursue its political goals while staunchly resisting more detailed investigation into the origins of the virus. China has managed to acquire control of multilateral bodies like the ITU that are involved in identifying standards and making rules for the new technology 5G. Global supply chains across sectors are dominated by China, resulting in dependencies that tend to be exploited. But importantly now, there are also many credible countermeasures being scripted across countries, just like India did post-Gulf War. Almost all major powers now have an Indo-Pacific policy, a plan to diversify supply chains, screening tech investment from China, among other steps. Delhi needs to play itself back into lead position in China game, and for that it needs to rebuild faster, inspire confidence through better preparedness against future COVID spread, and demonstrate that it can breathe life back to its economy. There is no doubt that India is some measure or other will always have a role to play in any global counter to China. But it's the comeback script that will, in today's backdrop, condition its global reliability, by extension its credibility. It's time for India again, like I said. A strong India to keep China peaceful. The CCP presents itself as an alternative to the liberal democratic order, a model of prosperity without the messiness of democracy. Countering an aggressive China, given its centrality in the global economy, calls for a strong India, moving ahead on the wings of democracy. And here, folks, like it's been pointed out, it's time for India to re-enter this game, and it's an opportune time. Unfortunately, we are once again going to probably get caught up in the hurly-burly of domestic politics, another bunch of divisive domestic politics coming up in Uttar Pradesh and the 6-7 states. But if India stays focused at this time, stays focused, which I see the External Affairs Minister is making the necessary trips to, whether it's to Greece, whether it is to Italy. These are the only two, as I told you, countries that were kind of, and Germany, which were like, are still hold back as far as EU's conversation goes with China. But folks, the winds are behind India. The winds, and China is facing strong headwinds. This is the right time to counterattack, and maybe this 50,000 repositioning of India's troops from the Pakistani border to the Eastern Front is a message in time, folks. Jai Hind.